Learning objectives. So, let me begin my chapter on management of natural resources. At the end of this topic, you will be able to define the terms reduce, recycle, and reuse, understand the necessity of managing our resources, describe the methods of conservation of forests and wildlife, discuss about sustainable management, explain the necessity of water, describe the methods of conservation of water through dams and water harvesting techniques, explain the conservation of coal and petroleum, outline the need of natural resource management.
Introduction. Rita and her grandmother. I've told you about the pollution of these resources because of some of our activities.
Yes. Can you tell me about some of our resources and how we are using them?
Sure. We shall be looking at our natural resources like forests, wildlife, water, coal, and petroleum and see what are the issues at stake in deciding how these resources are to be managed for sustainable development. We often hear or read about our environmental problems. Right. These are often global level problems and we feel helpless to make any changes. There are international laws and regulations, and then there are our own national laws and acts for environmental protection. There are also national and international organizations working towards protecting our environment. Let me tell you more about this in this chapter. Introduction.
Ganga Action Plan. Awareness about the problems caused by unthinkingly exploiting our resources has been a fairly recent phenomenon in our society. And once this awareness rises, some action is usually taken. You must have heard about the Ganga Action Plan. This multi-crore project came about in 1985 because the quality of water in the Ganga was very poor. Coliform is a group of bacteria found in human intestines whose presence in water indicates contamination by disease-causing microorganisms. There are some measurable factors which are used to quantify pollution or the quality of the water that we use for various activities. Some of the pollutants are harmful, even when present in very small quantities, and we require sophisticated equipment to measure them. We have learned that the pH of water is something that can easily be checked using universal indicator. But we need not feel powerless or overwhelmed by the scale of the problems because there are many things we can do to make a difference. You must have come across the 3 R's to save the environment: reduce, recycle, and reuse. Reduce. This means that you use less. You save electricity by switching off unnecessary lights and fans. You save water by repairing leaky taps. You do not waste food. Recycle. This means that you collect plastic, paper, glass, and metal items and recycle these materials to make required things instead of synthesizing or extracting fresh plastic, paper, glass, or metal. In order to recycle, we first need to segregate our wastes so that the materials that can be recycled are not dumped along with other wastes. Reuse. This is actually even better than recycling because the process of recycling uses some energy. In the reuse strategy, you simply use the things again and again. Instead of throwing away used envelopes, you can reverse it and use it again. The plastic bottles in which you buy various food items like jam or pickle can be used for storing things in the kitchen.
Why do we need to manage our resources?
As natural resources are not unlimited and with human population increasing at a tremendous rate due to improvement in healthcare, the demand for all resources is increasing at an exponential rate. The management of natural resources requires a long-term perspective so that these will last for generations to come and will not merely be exploited to the hilt for short-term gains. This management should also ensure equitable distribution of resources so that all, and not just a handful of rich and powerful people, benefit from the development of these resources. Another factor to be considered while we exploit these natural resources is the damage we cause to the environment while these resources are either extracted or used.
Forests and wildlife.
Forests are biodiversity hotspots. One measure of the biodiversity of an area is the number of species found there. However, the range of different life forms, bacteria, fungi, ferns, flowering plants, nematodes, insects, birds, reptiles, and so on, is also important. One of the main aims of conservation is to try and preserve the biodiversity we have inherited. Experiments and field studies suggest that a loss of diversity may lead to a loss of ecological stability. We will use various forest produce, but our dependency on forest resources varies. Some of us have access to alternatives, some do not. When we consider the conservation of forests, we need to look at the stakeholders who are 1. The people who live in or around forests are dependent on forest produce for various aspects of their life. 2. The forest department of the government, which owns the land and controls the resources from the forests. 3. The industrialists, from those who use tendu leaves to make beedis to the ones with paper mills, who use various forest produce but are not dependent on the forests in any one area. 4. The wildlife and nature enthusiasts who want to conserve nature in its pristine form. Let's take a look at what each of these groups needs or gets out of the forests. The local people need large quantities of firewood, small timber, and thatch. Bamboo is used to make slats for huts and baskets for collecting and storing food materials. Implements for agriculture, fishing, and hunting are largely made out of wood. Also, forests are sites for fishing and hunting. In addition to people gathering fruits, nuts, and medicines from the forests, their cattle also graze in forest areas or feed on some other fodder which is collected from the forests. After the British took control of the forests, people were forced to depend on much smaller areas, and forest resources started becoming overexploited to some extent. The Forest Department in independent India took over from the British, but local knowledge and local needs continued to be ignored in the management practices. Thus, vast tracts of forests have been converted to monocultures of pine, teak, or eucalyptus. In order to plant these trees, huge areas are first cleared of all vegetation. This destroys a large amount of biodiversity in the area. Not only this, the varied needs of the local people, leaves for fodder, herbs for medicines, fruits and nuts for food, can no longer be met from such forests. Such plantations are useful for the industries to access specific products and are an important resource of revenue for the Forest Department. Industries would consider the forest as merely a source of raw material for its factories, and huge interest groups lobby the government for access to these raw materials at artificially low rates. Since these industries have a greater reach than the local people, they're not interested in the sustainability of the forest in one particular area. For example, after cutting down all the teak trees in one area, they will get the teak from a forest farther away. They do not have any stake in ensuring that one particular area should yield an optimal amount of some produce for all generations to come. Lastly, we come to the nature and wildlife enthusiasts who are in no way dependent on the forests, but who may have considerable say in the management. The conservationists were initially taken up with large animals like lions, tigers, elephants, and rhinoceros. They now recognize the need to preserve biodiversity as a whole. There have been enough instances of local people working traditionally for conservation of forests. For example, the case of the Bishnoi community in Rajasthan, for whom conservation of forest and wildlife has been a religious tenet. The Government of India has recently instituted an Amrita Devi Bishnoi National Award for Wildlife Conservation in the memory of Amrita Devi Bishnoi, who in 1731 sacrificed her life along with 363 others for the protection of K12 trees in Kechrali village near Jodhpur in Rajasthan. Studies have shown that the prejudice against the traditional use of forest areas has no basis. Here is an example. The Great Himalayan National Park contains, within its reserved areas, alpine meadows which were grazed by sheep in summer. Nomadic shepherds drove their flock up from the valleys every summer. When this national park was formed, this practice was put to an end. Now it is seen that without the regular grazing by sheep, the grass first grows very tall and then falls over, preventing fresh growth. Management of protected areas by keeping the local people out by using force cannot possibly be successful in the long run. In any case, the damage caused to forests cannot be attributed to only the local people. One cannot turn a blind eye to the deforestation caused by industrial needs or development projects like building roads or dams. The Chipko Andolan, Hug the Trees movement, was the result of a grassroots level effort to end the alienation of people from their forests. The movement originated from an incident in a remote village called Reni in Garhwal, high up in the Himalayas, during the early 1970s. There was a dispute between the local villagers and a logging contractor who had been allowed to fell trees in a forest close to the village. On a particular day, the contractor's workers appeared in the forest to cut the trees while the menfolk were absent. Undeterred, the women of the village reached the forest quickly and clasped the tree trunks, thus preventing the workers from felling the trees. Thus thwarted, the contractor had to withdraw. Inherent in such a competition to control a natural resource is the conservation of a replenishable resource. Specifically, the method of use was being called into question. The contractor would have felled the trees, destroying them forever. The Chipko movement quickly spread across communities and media and forced the government, to whom the forests belong, to rethink their priorities in the use of forest produce. Experience has taught people that the destruction of forests affected not just the availability of forest products, but also the quality of soil and the sources of water. Participation of the local people can indeed lead to the efficient management of forests.
Water for all.
Water is a basic necessity for all terrestrial forms of life. However, human intervention also changes the availability of water in various regions. A study of rainfall patterns does not reveal the whole truths behind the water availability in various regions in India. Rains in India are largely due to the monsoons. This means that most of the rainfall in a few months of the year. This means that most of the rain falls in a few months of the year. Despite nature's monsoon bounty, failure to sustain water availability underground has resulted largely from the loss of vegetation cover, diversion for high water demanding crops, and pollution from industrial effluents and urban wastes. Irrigation methods like dams, tanks, and canals have been used in various parts of India since ancient times. These were generally local interventions managed by the local people and assured that the basic minimum requirement for both agriculture and daily needs were met throughout the year. The use of this stored water was strictly regulated, and the optimum cropping patterns based on the water availability were arrived on the basis of decades or centuries of experience. The maintenance of these irrigation systems was also a local affair. The arrival of the British changed these systems as it changed many other things. The conception of large-scale projects, large dams and canals traversing large distances were first conceived and implemented by the British and carried on with no less gusto by our newly formed independent government. These mega projects led to the neglect of the local irrigation methods, and the government also increasingly took over the administration of these systems, leading to the loss of control over local water resources by the local people. Large dams can ensure the storage of adequate water, not just for irrigation, but also for generating electricity. Canal systems leading from these dams can transfer large amounts of water great distances. For example, the Indira Gandhi Canal has brought greenery to considerable areas of Rajasthan. However, mismanagement of the water has largely led to the benefits being garnered by a few people. There is no equitable distribution of water. Thus, people close to the source grow water-intensive crops like sugarcane and rice, while people farther downstream do not get any water. The woes of these people, who have been promised benefits which never arrived, are added to the discontentment among the people who have been displaced by the building of the dam and its canal network. We have discussed the reasons for opposition to the construction of large dams, such as the Tehri Dam on the river Ganga. You must have read about the protests by the Narmada Bachao Andolan, Save the Narmada movement, about raising the heights of the Sardar Sarovar Dam on the river Narmada. Criticisms about large dams address three problems in particular. 1. Social problems, because they displace large number of peasants and tribals without adequate compensation or rehabilitation. 2. Economic problems, because they swallow up huge amounts of public money without the generation of proportionate benefits. 3. Environmental problems, because they contribute enormously to deforestation and the loss of biological diversity. The people who have been displaced by various development projects are largely poor tribals who do not get any benefits from these projects and are alienated from their lands and forests without adequate compensation. The Ustis of the Tawa Dam, built in the 1970s, are still fighting for the benefits they were promised. Watershed management emphasizes scientific soil and water conservation in order to increase the biomass production. The aim is to develop primary resources of land and water to produce secondary resources of plants and animals for use in a manner which will not cause ecological imbalance. Watershed management not only increases the production and income of the watershed community, but also mitigates droughts and floods and increases the life of the downstream dam and reservoirs. Various organizations have been working on rejuvenating ancient systems of water harvesting as an alternative to the mega projects like dams. These communities have used hundreds of indigenous water-saving methods to capture every trickle of water that had fallen on their land, dug small pits and lakes, put in place simple watershed systems, built small earthen dams, constructed dikes, sand and limestone reservoirs, set up rooftop water collecting units. This has recharged the groundwater levels and even brought rivers back to life. Water harvesting is an age-old concept in India. Khadans, tanks, nadis in Rajasthan, bhandaras, tals in Maharashtra, bundis in Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh, ahars and pines in Bihar, kuls in Himachal Pradesh, ponds in the Kandi belt of Jammu region, and eris, tanks in Tamil Nadu, surangams in Kerala, and kattas in Karnataka are some of the ancient water harvesting, including water conveyance structures, still in use today. Water harvesting techniques are highly local specific and benefits are also localized. Giving people control over their local water resources ensures that mismanagement and overexploitation of these resources is reduced or removed. In largely level terrain, the water harvesting structures are mainly crescent-shaped earthen embankments or low, straight concrete and rubble check dams built across seasonally flooded gullies. Monsoon rains fill ponds behind the structures. Only the larger structures hold water year-round. Most dry up 6 months or less after the monsoons. Their main purpose, however, is not to hold surface water, but to recharge the groundwater beneath. The advantages of water stored in the ground are many. It does not evaporate, but spreads out to recharge wells and provides moisture for vegetation over a wide area. In addition, it does not provide breeding grounds for mosquitoes like stagnant water collected in ponds or artificial lakes.
Coal and petroleum.
We have seen some of the issues involved in the conservation and sustainable use of resources like forests, wildlife, and water. These can meet our needs perpetually if we were to use them in a sustainable manner. Now we come to yet another important resource: fossil fuels. That is, coal and petroleum, which are important sources of energy for us. Since the Industrial Revolution, we have been using increasing amounts of energy to meet our basic needs and for the manufacture of a large number of goods upon which our lives depend. These energy needs have been largely met by the reserves of coal and petroleum. Coal and petroleum were formed from the degradation of biomass millions of years ago, and hence these are resources that will be exhausted in the future, no matter how carefully we use them. And then we would need to look for alternative sources of energy. Various estimates as to how long these resources will last exist, and one is that at present rates of usage, our known petroleum resources will last us for about 40 years and coal resources will last for another 200 years. Some simple choices can make a difference in our energy consumption patterns. The management of coal and petroleum also addresses the efficiency of our machines. Fuel is most commonly used in internal combustion engines for transportation, and recent research in this field concentrates on ensuring complete combustion in these engines in order to increase efficiency and also reduce air pollution.
Water for all. An overview of natural resource management.
Sustainable management of natural resources is a difficult task. In addressing this issue, we need to keep an open mind with regard to the interests of various stakeholders. We need to accept that people will act with their own best interests as the priority. But the realization that such selfish goals will lead to misery for a large number of people and a total destruction of our environment is slowly growing. Going beyond laws, rules, and regulations, we need to tailor our requirements individually and collectively so that the benefits of development reach everyone now and for all generations to come.
Summary.
Let's summarize the topic. Water is a basic necessity for all forms of life. Rains in India are mainly due to the monsoons. Watershed management focuses on scientific soil and water conservation. Coal and petroleum were formed from the degradation of biomass millions of years ago.